I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today and to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And also nā mai haere mai ki te whānau o Aotearoa o whakawhanaungatanga. I'm a very proud Kiwi that's borrowing cairns for the moment, and it's really nice to be in front of an Australasian audience. Tracy, my colleague, table's going to just drop some envelopes on your tables. We've got a small participatory activity about halfway through. If you could not open the envelopes until we get to it, that would be great. A small element of surprise for you. They're not, you're not going to win last night's competition or this morning's free trip out of the envelope, but a bit of information to think about afterwards. So, as a nation, we're fond of talking up resilience in Australia. At any major or challenging event, the word kind of pops out these days. And if you're a Queenslander, you're possibly aware that one of the state's aims is for Queensland to be the most resilient state in Australia. But how do we know what resilience really is and what it actually looks like? And this was one of the challenges we set ourselves in Cairns, particularly in the disaster management sphere. So although my job is around disaster resilience primarily, it hasn't taken me long to connect some dots around community resilience in general and its importance to how people respond and react when an emergency or some kind of disaster occurs. So this process we undertook distinctly has a disaster orientation focus, but it will be of interest to lots of other people that are looking at community resilience in general. And I've tried to focus on the process around collaboration and participation that we used. That was the focus of the entry into the awards, in fact, as well as the disaster kind of focus on that work. So hopefully that will come through. So what is community resilience? And for anybody that's done any work in this field, you'll be aware that there are lots and lots of definitions around these things, but very little agreement on what the meaning actually is. And this lack of consensus makes it very difficult when we're trying to grow resilience and measure what it's achieving. In our world, Cairns is a United Nations disaster risk reduction resilient city. It's in fact the only city in Australia that's got that status. So you may be aware of another program called the 100 Resilient Cities. It's an entirely different program. It's funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. We're not really funded at all, other than through the state. But we try to incorporate this into our work. And I've given you there the UN ISDR's version of resilience. So for our purposes, it's about a continuous engagement process that continues to build community strength and allow for healthy recovery after any major, generally adverse event. And in Cairns, this underpins the work that we do in my strategy, the Cairns Be Ready Resilience Building Program. And in Queensland, as in many other states, resilience has been clearly defined as everyone's responsibility. So it's kind of one of those things where it's everybody's and nobody's, but what we're building on is the fact that everybody needs to be engaged to make this happen. So for those who don't know Cairns very well and are under the illusion that it's a bit like a large sanctuary cove, people sort of say to me, "God, it must be amazing," and my only answer to this is when you live somewhere that's a holiday resort and work there, it's a bit different to being on holiday there. So this is what we're dealing with on a daily basis. We have a highly complex socioeconomic makeup. Not many people stay in Cairns. There's actually not a lot of professional work there unless you work for the council or one of the state departments that were Newman some years ago. We have hundreds of thousands of tourists that roll through the place pretty much year-round now. There isn't really a tourist season anymore. And some very different geographic communities spread widely from north to south. We haven't had a major disaster since severe tropical cyclone Yasi in 2011, and this has given rise to a lot of urban myths and beliefs around things like we'll never have a tsunami here because we've got the Great Barrier Reef, and the emphasis is always on the barrier, so this will somehow stop a tsunami. The other favourite one is that cyclones apparently bounce off hills now, and there are large hills behind Cairns, and so this means the cyclones are either pushed further north or south, or they'll roll inland. Climate denial is alive and well, so it's been lovely to be at a conference like this where many more of us are accepting that this is a problem. And we have most people kind of thinking that if there's a big issue, that someone else will take care of it. So they're not sure who this someone else is, but as long as it's not them, it's fine, and all will be well. And this has formed the structure to the work that we've done over the last sort of 5 to 7 years since I've been there. So we got sort of a bit tired of hearing this, gosh, we're really resilient. something happened here, everybody helped their neighbours, we don't know who everybody is, but apparently they all did it. We all kind of bounced back, everybody got a house back and so on, and we said, well, we've got a lot of empirical evidence, but what do we actually know about behaviour and how that may have changed as a result of what we've done? How resilient actually are we? And in this project we brought together two different purposes or two different types of scorecard campaigns. So there's an organisation that some of you may know of called the Torrens Institute, which developed a scorecard that's very much to do with social cohesion and community capacity. And the UN ISDR scorecard, which we'll look at in a bit more detail, which is a much more complex process of looking at resilience overall, and we'll get to talking about that in a minute. So we really used the Torrens process to provide more information for the UN ISDR process. We ran the Torrens process first with actually looking at more detail around 5 different selected communities, and then we fed that into the UN ISDR scorecard criteria. The major point about this really from a collaborative point of view was that in Cairns, communities are not typically asked by my organisation about what's relevant for them or on ground that they inhabit. People are generally invited to council chambers to do these things and asked questions that have a predetermined outcome. So the way we approached this was met with a bit of surprise, and it's all good old-fashioned stuff. I love the discussion this morning that doesn't occur in my world very often. And also our local disaster management group having to put their thoughts together around how they have a shared responsibility for these things. So in Queensland, every council has a local disaster management group that manages a coordinated response to any major emergency. And the idea is that the group as a collective brings its thoughts together to promote these things. In reality, as we discovered, it's much more about a perception that the council does these things and everybody else kind of plays around in the background, and we'll get to the challenges that that created for us. So we did, the program was instituted using the IAP2 spectrum, with the levels of information being really quite important because we still needed to talk to people about hazard awareness and understanding and provide that level of background, and then consulting and involving people along the way. And collaborating more with some of our partners, and this was where the local disaster management group function came in. So this is me at Woolworths at Raintree Shopping Mall, which is a fairly low socioeconomic area in Cairns, widely frequented by people that come and hang around and do their shopping, with our friends from the fire service. Now, if you've never worked with the fire service before, I highly commend it to you. They really like coffee and donuts. They can do things that I can't. So they can turn up in a uniform with a fire truck and actively walk up to children and give them stickers and ask them to come and talk to people, whereas we have all sorts of rules that, you know, the council couldn't possibly do that. You might be seen as soliciting something that you shouldn't be doing. So, yeah, hop in there with the police, with the fire service. It's good fun. We went through a process of community mapping that will not be new to most of the people in this room to really look at who we were going to be working with for the Torrens Institute process. So went back to, that says 2011 census data, that was true at the time. We would of course use the updated data now to look at vulnerability factors. And when I say that, one of the things that we have found in Cairns is that vulnerability is assessed in some unusual ways, and we potentially disagree with that a lot of the time. So someone yesterday was talking about not referring to older people as elderly, as elder people or older people, which is definitely how we view them. You know, my experience is that older people are really resilient. They're used to doing without. They can remember Christmases where the shops were shut for a week, and they're quite used to sort of managing on their own. Blind people, when I go to talk to them, they think it's funny because the lights are out for them all the time. And they say, "Gosh, dear, it's not a problem for us. We're used to it." So this was not a background that I socially kind of came from. I had to learn a lot about this as I went, but I have definitely found out that our version of what's vulnerable and the people that are vulnerable are often two different things. And resilience is not defined by things like money. So some of the people who are well off are very dependent on money and the things that money can buy. People that come from poorer socioeconomic communities are again often used to doing without. It's not such a problem with them. So we looked at some overlays for geographic vulnerability in Cairns as well, and came up with 4 different communities that we were going to work with, where a number of these vulnerability factors, whether it was by socioeconomic or other grouping, or whether it was by geographic hazard, were coming together. So these might not mean much to most of you, but Yorkeys, there's only in Cairns because you have a suburb called Yorkeys Knob. was used as a bit of a controlled suburb against the rest because it had a good mix of other factors. So I've provided the link here for anybody that's interested to the Torrens Institute scorecard. We didn't put it into place exactly. We did a sort of a modified version, adapting the tool to produce a community survey that broadly looked at resilience as well as other community strengthening factors. And administered the survey personally in conjunction with some of these other partners. So the personal side of it was really important. In many instances, people had never seen a council officer in their local shopping centre after 5 o'clock or on a Saturday morning. Now, I'm sure this sounds very basic to a lot of people here, but this was not the way things had been done in Cairns. And in fact, even me going out on my own to some of these things after hours was deemed dodgy and a bit unusual. And they were sort of a bit surprised that we were interested in doing, but it was how we captured people on their own ground. So most people loved it. I'll show you the questions in a minute. They were very open questions. There were really no right nor wrong answers. And some of them were a bit unusual. They weren't about judging or prioritising. But a few people hated it. And this quote at the bottom was from a guy at Yorkie's Knob, in fact. So we were sat up with a little table and some banners and lots of free giveaways outside the local IGA on a Saturday evening. And he walked past and said, "Oh, look, fix this." And I said, "Oh, it's a council survey." So he gave me chapter and verse about his latest parking ticket, and then said, "I'd rather die than do your bloody survey," and walked off. So we had a word with his local councillor and put a quote in the next newsletter that the Yorkie's Knob Association puts out. So here's the survey. It was 10 questions. The questions don't take very long to administer. One of the ones that people were interested in was how connected people that live in your area are. And a lot of people didn't know how to answer this question. They sort of said, what sort of connectivity? And we said, well, we're not really talking about, are you Facebook friends with the person next door? Do you know the person next door? Do you speak to them? Are there community events and so on? And in many cases, people from the same suburb had a very different view of that connectivity. What sort of disasters? These were obviously questions that were pointed at disaster issues. And then some simple ones. Do you have a household emergency plan? Do you have a household emergency kit? To which the answer was often sort of. So people were a bit reluctant to say they did or they didn't. And the other question that was interesting was, what sort of contact do you have with your council? And a lot of people said none. Now, we prompted them a bit on that to say, well, what about rates? Do you have a dog? All those sorts of questions. But they didn't actually think about those things as council connections. And some quite interesting conversations were generated around what councils actually do, who provides those services. It's not just the rubbish truck and so on. And as I said, we did this surveying in communities. So I'm there at the Babinda Harvest Festival on a hot Saturday afternoon with one person, and one of the other large shopping malls in Cairns with another. So it's very easy for people to fill out. We had lots of free resources and giveaways to give people that were targeted around disaster resilience. So we give away, for instance, things like mobile phone and battery recharges. They're quite expensive to buy. People really like having these as a free gift, but they had to do the survey first. It wasn't just giving things away. So what did we learn from this part of the process? I guess we did get a much clearer indication of where the factors of resilience from a Torrens Institute perspective were and where more effort was needed. And so this strengthened our resilience by looking at where some of the key gaps in knowledge and understanding were. And one of the outstanding ones, in fact, and this might seem quite simple, but it made me realise that people are often very unaware of their surroundings these days. When your surrounding constitutes a mobile phone, people don't actually look at where the local fire station is or the local ambulance station, for example. And a lot of people thought that the community hall was some kind of disaster management centre. So completely wrong. We don't use those locations for those purposes. We were certainly able to look at who had a household emergency kit and who didn't, and some of those more basic things. And we provided a platform for people to talk to some of those other external agencies and sometimes their elected representative, but they wouldn't normally have the chance to do in that kind of setting. And just going to those other community venues to talk about some of those community connections was really important. So then we started tackling this much larger project of the United Nations 10 Essentials scorecard. So there's a new version of this now, which I think is 115 essential criteria to evaluate. But when we did the process, there were 85 of what the UN ISDR calls these essentials that focus on research, organisation, infrastructure, response capability and capacity within communities, response capacity of the environment, and then obviously recovery. So the way this works is that each of these essentials is broken down into a series of little kind of factors to measure, and we're going to play with that in a minute. And then you have to assess them on a scale of 0 to 5. So 0 usually means the resilience factor for that essential is hopeless, or there isn't any. 5 means you're top of the class. And to achieve a 5 can be quite difficult. So in a situation where you might think that we live incredibly well prepared and incredibly resilient, these factors really, really tease down into the detail of what you need to look at. And again, the link is there, and you'll be getting these presentations to have a look at how this works. So on your table, if you've got a little orange envelope that you can open that now, and what I've provided you with is an example of one of the factors that we had to assess. So remembering this is just one of 85 of these factors, and I tried to pick something that was of general interest that you could all relate to, because some of these things are a bit difficult, so I'll bring it up on the screen in a minute for people that don't have an envelope. And to show you how difficult it can be to assess these things that seem quite simple until you start thinking about them in any detail. So here it is. So this is part of Essential 2, which is about financing and incentives, and it's about insurance levels. So if you live somewhere that doesn't have good commercial and domestic insurance coverage, your resilience level following a major disaster is going to be challenged. And to score these things is not as simple as it seems. So I'm sure you're all sitting there thinking you can just ask the Insurance Council of Australia. Well, you can't. Or if anybody has and has got the answer, I'd really like to talk to them about how they strong-armed the Insurance Council into giving them that information. And you have to look at the assessment criteria quite carefully. So you'll notice that in 5, you're asked to assess housing losses that are likely from the most severe scenario in your area. The others are all about most probable scenarios. So there are some quite big differences in, in how you look at these things and how you assess them. So just maybe for a minute have a think about how much you would have that information available to you in your area, and if not, where you might begin to find it, or where else in other information you might find that in the area that you live in.
Let us know.
So, not sure how you went with this, but it's an example of one of the issues that we had in how to collaborate with other organisations. It's good that people are talking, generating some discussion. How we work with other organisations to pull this information together. Now, I'm at a loss to discover why this is such a secret. We're not asking for anybody's individual domestic insurance coverage, but the insurance industry regards this stuff as highly confidential, and it's not helpful when you're trying to assess in a collaborative way the resilience of a particular region. So in terms of running the scorecard process, this was really the first time our whole local disaster management group had been asked to consider these factors as a group. They couldn't just go back to their offices in the police station or at the Queensland Fire and Emergency Service office and debate it on their own. We wanted them to bring it to the table and discuss it so we all had an understanding of of where these issues are at. So, you know, the way this is done very much within organisations in far north Queensland is you provide the document, everybody takes it away, you give them a month to provide some feedback. If you're lucky, you might get some feedback. If you're unlucky, you won't. But in some ways that makes it easier because then you just approve the document and they all sign it off not having really read it at the end of the process. They couldn't get away with this in this circumstance. We gave everybody the relevant criteria to look at and then they had to come back with some scores. And they were kind of nervous about doing this openly as well. So, you know, this wasn't the way they're used to doing things. What typically happens at LDNG meetings is people mumble into their collars about what they've been doing or not doing around these issues and wish that the meeting would finish. So it had provided a bit of a different forum for people to bring that information together. And there were lots and lots of challenges. So people did genuinely think it was some kind of trap, I suspect. Why do you want to know those things? And it's like, well, they're indicators that a very worthy body, the UN, has worked out that we can measure our resilience by. So a lot of information is regarded as potentially sensitive, and this was particularly around things like budgeting for resilience management and so on. People were awfully nervous about the score not being 5. And we said this is a work in progress, it's not an end result. Nobody is going to be perfect unless perhaps you're in a very small developing village somewhere where you can get it all right. There was very much a perception of information ownership and other people not having it. And this thing about a reluctance to come to our own solutions was very difficult to manage around, you know, it not being a shared responsibility. And there was this perception of some weird background agenda that I just didn't understand that kind of seemed to be floating around, particularly in agencies like the Queensland Police Service, Ergon, some of the other commercial interests and so on. And so we had to really instigate this sustained program of communication and trust in the information being kept where it belonged to move along. So what did we find from all of this? Again, we had this highlighting of where the resilience strengths and weaknesses were, and this is the value of a process which is so detailed. It really, really, really showed up the things that needed work and the things that didn't. So clarifying roles was particularly important, and not surprisingly, this process did really show up that me, the resilience officer, was doing most of the resilience work for the entire region with some very good support from my one colleague at Queensland Fire and Emergency Services. But that other people were just kind of really not doing their job around it. We had gaps in process where people had looked at single hazards, for example, and so an all hazards assessment approach is now the order of the day. It's not just about the thing that is most likely or most probable, it is also about the thing that could have the most severe effect. And so in Cairns, for example, it's not true that the Great Barrier Reef stops tsunamis, really. It's rated from a likelihood level as the least likely, but its effect has been rated as catastrophic. So again, it's not just about one hazard. We definitely had some big gaps in different infrastructural aspects. So the insurance is one. Another was difficulty with emergency fuel supplies in Cairns, one road in, one road out. Emergency communication systems were poor, and a big gap that's lent itself to a very interesting current research project was about the resilience of our ecosystem services. So sort of pertinent to the conversation we were having this morning and yesterday around if you get rid of all your ecosystems, what happens to the resilience that was inherent in that area before you put a building where the mangroves used to be. And we've gone on evaluating this process and working on it since the findings came out. So a significant part of the purpose was to demonstrate the shared responsibility for getting organisations to work together. And this bringing people together in a room to work on things with a common understanding, go away and then come back was important, and so we went through validation exercises for this. So after we'd run the initial workshop to get people to score the essentials where they had a particular interest, I assessed all of that, added the scores up, we distributed those and got everybody back to validate the process. So if a particular essential had scored really low, was that right? Had somebody just been depressed on the day? You know, maybe they didn't like the subject, but now they'd changed their mind. But interestingly, most of the scores did actually stay the same. And so that was that second workshop where people were brought back together to work together and to see themselves as real contributors to this process. So, you know, it's no good getting the power back online if we don't have enough supplies to last us in an emergency situation. And we really push this kind of ongoing message about this is for, you know, it's for the greater good. So my friends here from Hot Fuzz, if you know this movie, we're all about the greater good. And we still think this is an area that really needs work in developing community resilience as a shared process. So overall outcomes, that we do now have this great baseline measure of resilience for the region on which we can build and move on. So we started this process 3 to 4 years ago, and we're going to be in the process now of renewing that and reviewing it in the coming year. And that work will be incorporated into the review of our resilience strategy for the region. And I think it's important where there are high scores to maintain those, so you don't want to lose the relevance and the resilience that you've got by focusing on the lower scores and not keeping the top ones going. And in some cases, scoring a 5 is never going to be possible, and where you're faced with an essential measure that says something like, you have to provide your disaster information in every language that is spoken in your region and ensure that the people that read it understand it. It's a very difficult essential to measure, and we can't in Cairns. We've got a good indicator of where that's at because we do provide information in lots of different languages for the multiplicity of communities that have very little English, but we couldn't prove this essential one way or the other. The community interactions have definitely had an ongoing benefit around resilience and around community connectivity. So again, it was a very basic process using a personally administered survey. But it really established some great trust between those communities and the council, and certainly within the disaster management unit. So trust is a big issue for us. We need people to be able to trust us to provide the information that they need in times of emergency. And we have had demonstrated feedback and ongoing commitment to that trust in those relationships. And just getting some of the information right about where your local emergency services or where you can or cannot go in a cyclone, for example, is very important. And I think overall the outcomes of this process can be widely shared with others throughout the disaster community and others looking at community resilience. So as a result of us running this process, the first people in Australia to run it, we hosted a UNISDR workshop for the South Pacific on how to do this 2 years ago. So we've started a chain of things that is useful for other people that people can administer on their own. And my colleague who's following this discussion is running a session on how not to be afraid of the process. I think what we've tried to do with this scorecard process is to tell people it sounds like a big thing, but it's implementable. So if we can do it with a few of us in Cairns, you can run these sorts of processes in other places, even if you're not looking at your whole region or your whole area, and get some good realistic group feedback on how to do the process. And we've certainly had a lot of interest and attention from it. So more to come on this. If you're interested, I'm happy to talk later in a bit more detail about what we did. But using collaboration principles was really the key to success in all of this, and not trying to do it all ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here in Queensland. Yesterday I ran a 7-hour workshop on a community development approach to crisis recovery. I've got another one tomorrow. That's not me squeaking. You have to worry. If you know Billy Connolly, you know what he says about after you turn 60, you have to be very careful when you move quickly because you squeak. So I just hope that wasn't me squeaking. And my other experience recently in Queensland was actually, I did the community development strategy for Cairns and woke up one morning about 4 o'clock and looked at BOM Bureau's website, and it had this big red thing heading towards the coast, so I rang Qantas and I flew out. So that's my best method of managing disasters: run as fast as you can. Can't catch me, I'm okay. The thing that I want to talk about today is not based on theory, it's based on what we do. And we do it every day. And we do it in projects which are huge and projects which are tiny. So we're working on a project at the moment where we've just sent a letter to 61,000 residents in one local government because we want them to know that they are allowed to have their say somewhere. And then we've got a multiplicity of different ways of interacting with them. And we work with schools and churches on how to be more relevant in wherever they happen to be. So we don't mind the size. We just think it's really important to have an approach which is relevant to the people that you're dealing with and is actually honouring of them rather than manipulative of them in whatever way it happens to be. So what I want to do is just run through a couple of the things we're doing. This is QE2 precinct. Those of you who know Perth, this is in Netherlands, and so it involves a university, 2 hospitals and perhaps a 3rd hospital, a couple of hundred research labs, and a couple of thousand people. So you can imagine dealing with scientists and academics, how easy it is to get consensus about nothing. And then the mayor, sorry, that's a different story. I can talk for hours and say, it's lucky the third big speaker didn't turn up today. Actually, he knew I was speaking, so left. It's not true. This one was BHP in the Pilbara. This was during one of their expansion projects where they were spending $8 billion on expanding their projects, and it involved over 60 different projects which required community consultation in Port Hedland and Newman, and had to engage with every government department on 60 different occasions. So they came to us and said, so we said, let's have one narrative. Let's develop one approach for all of those projects. We had a file about 3 inches thick with all the collateral in it, and amazingly in an organisation like BHP, that was socialised through their whole organisation in about 2.5 days. So everybody was on board, and so rather than the community dealing with 60 different things, and people were already over-consulted, they had to deal with one. This was a real ripper. We did the economic development strategy for Broome, and the reason why they picked a sociologist with a community development company to lead it was because this was just after James Price Point, when Broome people hated each other because of the controversy around a gas plant which was coming in just above it. And so I might come back to this later, because this is the array, that's one of the pages of the array of ways which we engage with that community, because there were 19 different Aboriginal body corporates, and they range from one group called Yaru, who are a sophisticated, amazing group of folk who've got their act together really well, to people who are just beginning that 15-year process. And so that was just one of the issues, let alone dealing with people who were actually coming to fisticuffs in the car park over the way that they viewed development. This is a retirement centre in a suburb where we were simply changing the way that a retirement aged care facility deals with the silent generation and the baby boomers. Because you're dead right, the silent generation have survived everything. Now, they survived a depression and the Second World War, and they were often children of the First World War, so they were happy to be alive. So their aged care facility, as long as they ate and slept, they were fairly happy. We're baby boomers, we're arseholes, let's be truthful. Our expectations of life are so high, we are still in charge. We are never going to age, and we are telling aged care providers what we expect rather than the other way around. And so a lot of the providers need to change the facilities, and yet their neighbours don't want it to be 1 metre higher or whatever. And so you need to engage in a manner which is appropriate. This was a hotel in Freo. Can you imagine? We've done lots of work in Fremantle. Fremantle is it's the gathering place for every flat earther in the Southern Hemisphere. Normally academics, normally sacked academics, who have a really high opinion of their opinion and don't think anything should ever change. And so that was an interesting project. This one is just south of there, and this is a brownfield redevelopment. So this involved a TAFE campus, a high school, and a whole heap of I'll call it Department of Housing because people know that's what it is, even though we've changed the name in Western Australia 30 times to try and hide its real truth about it. And this one was Port Hedland, which we've just completed, and it's really interesting. Again, it was the local mayor said we want at least a third of our people engaged in the process. That was the KPI, not whether it was valuable, but whether that a third of the people were involved. And so I'll tell you a little bit about that as we go. The point that I want to make and I'll come back to it on a number of different times during today, is that it's so important to build relationships and trust when you're involved in engaging with people. Because if you're not serious about relationships and trust, get a slick PR company to go and do it for you. Don't get people who, with a community development focus, who are actually saying, we care about the change that's happening. We understand that there needs to be change. We care, we want to engage with you in a manner which is honouring of you, but there still needs to be change. So being in that space is really important. And we always talk about this notion of a bulletproof process, because what people will do if they're opposed to something, they will fight you on every issue, and then they say your process was wrong. And so you have to make sure that you have a bulletproof process. So we're doing a very large development south of Perth, and they fought every single issue. And what we did was prove scientifically that they were wrong on each occasion, and then they said it wasn't fair because we didn't have enough say. So the bulletproof process is essential, and if you can stand up in front of people and go, we did this with integrity. We made sure that we covered every possible base so that you could be engaged in this. We did it in this sort of way and can explain it, and I'll show you some of the processes that we use. You can stand up in front of the decision makers and go, it was fair. People might not have agreed, but it was fair. And if you can do that from your heart, then nothing much is stressful, because you're actually being yourself. And it's so important in this whole process to actually be yourself, to do it based on what your values are, so that you're not pretending to be something else, and that's often where the stress comes. And I often say to engineers, and I apologise if they're like, are you an engineer? No. You just look a bit like an engineer. Intelligent. That if you don't like people, don't get involved in the engagement process. We'll use you as an expert, but please don't pretend that you actually enjoy chatting with folk. You might have guessed by now that I quite like talking to people. And I've got a little radio show in Perth I do once a week. One of the things I've been talking about, this is just a distraction, is, I did this for 7 hours yesterday, so I can go on.
Allan, I've got a timer.
Yeah. I was a boxing commissioner as well, so if you want to fight. Incidental conversations are great ways of growing community. So start incidental conversations, and if you're here by yourself, just walk up to people and start chatting with them. It's amazing what will happen. You'll find that someone might talk back.
Is your radio show a podcast?
Yeah.
Yeah. What's it called?
Allan's a dickhead. I'll tell you that. But it's really important from the beginning to clearly state what your objectives are and tell people numbers. So again, if you go back to the thing to do with aged care, we always start by finding out that you need 86 beds to be profitable. You know, have any of you been involved in the NDIS stuff?
Yep.
Crucifying not-for-profits in Australia. You need to be profitable. So when we're dealing with the in the aged care areas, we go, first thing you say is, how many beds do you need? Don't go, we've got an open sheet here. Because people will go, we want a building which is flat and blah, blah, blah. Yeah, no, we're not going to do it unless there are 86 beds. And so be very honest about the beginning bit. And it should be these things. I've been told that you can read, and it's in printing rather than writing, so it gives you a good chance. But the reality is these things need to be deeply embedded in what you do. And if they're not, you're not, in my view, you're not actually involved in engaging with people. You're actually doing something which is consulting, or you're actually providing them with information. And it's so important to be really clear about what engaging is. And this is just an interesting thing. Whenever you go into a community, you'll find where you are on the engagement continuum, and then your strategies need to support that. And often, whenever we are asked to come up with something, we always give the highest risk strategy. And then we say to our clients, if it's going okay at this gate, we won't do any of that. If it's going okay at that gate, we won't do any of this. But prepare for the worst, so that you're never caught off guard. And then if you prepare for the worst and you've got a bulletproof process, you can actually come backwards from that rather than step up because things are really tough. I'm sorry I'm boring you. Probably because I swore. It happens actually. Actually, the guy who was coordinating yesterday said his blood pressure kept doing this during the day. I can't remember why. And I'm going to come back to this later on if we've got time. But this is an approach that we use where it said talk about clarify your outcomes, engage in a manner which is appropriate to each of to your target market and each phase of whatever your project is. So, because what you want them to do is to be engaged in such a way that the relationship is so strong that they actually help you achieve your outcomes. That you want them to help you achieve your outcomes, but look, I'll show you can have these after, if you know what. And most of them are on our website, and if they're not, just give me a hoy and I'll put them on there. Because, you know, I thought you were taking photos of me. I didn't put my makeup on this morning as much as I should. Sorry, oops, one too many. I used gloss. But if you want them to be involved in your outcomes, it has to be about mutual self-benefit. You have to be willing to say, what is it that you're trying to achieve in your communities, and what can we do to help you? And that's what being if you're coming in, a lot of the projects we are involved in are going to be long-lasting projects, development projects in an area. So we want our client to say, we're going to be a good neighbour in this area. So you need to start that in the beginning of the process. The really interesting thing is that whenever you're involved in engagement, it's really important to understand that you're going into communities that are really suspicious. I just want to give you a couple of reasons about why. And the first is that Australia is based on the notion of the West. And it actually was geographic to start with. It came out of Western Europe and then spread to North America. The notion of the West has actually moved from being about geography to an approach. And this is the only time I need notes. And the notion of the West is mainly built around the fact that people had freedom, and the freedom was about having a widespread chance to create things. And there was a freedom for that, so it was widespread. And that created prosperity, stability and security. And then that created social trust and economic resources. And because of those things, it led back to more freedom. And what's happened, and what is said about that is that there were two key other things which were involved, and the first one was openness. That was the openness for new ideas, for stuff to sort of come from the bottom, for it to be about what I can create. It actually changed structures in society, and then it was also about equality. And this is equality both to economic resources, but also to the political process and decision-making processes. And one of the really intelligent people in this area said, without openness, the West can't thrive, and without equality, it can't survive. And we've got to the stage now. He's left his glasses, so it's coming back. He's got a very small bladder. Sorry, someone else will leave now. I'll probably offend you all by now. But the West is fracturing. And people have got to the stage where they are disillusioned. They think they are impotent in relation to their economic well-being and influencing things at a national or local or international level. And that means that they no longer trust institutions and government. And if you don't think that's true, think about the Royal Commission into child abuse. Think about the Royal Commission into the banks. And if you think about those areas, the banks, churches and government institutions were supposed to be the bedrocks of our society, and they were proved not to be. And if you can work through, the economists didn't predict the huge crash and people were still investing. Academics are arguing over climate change, and so people are saying that academics have any input into what's going on, so people are totally disillusioned. And when they get to that stage, they stop engaging. And what we need to have are people with those things. Because when they've got faith, when they've got hope and trust, they'll be optimistic, they'll strive, they'll participate, they'll contribute. And we're at a point in our society where those things are being shattered every day. And that's at the macro level. The other thing to recognise is it's really important to know what's going on at the local level as well. So this is the model that we use. We just talk about the need to discover, to design and to deliver in all of our projects, and particularly in engagement. This is another diagram we use which is really important, because often when something happens we go straight to, this is the thing we need to do, or we need government to provide another service because we've identified something's wrong. What we would argue, and including in this notion of where you're engaging about change, is to go, stop, think, conceptualise, ponder, and then go, what do we need to understand? What do we need to understand about the context and the people we're dealing with, and the trends that are going on, the stresses that people are under, and then we go, what's the insight that we can get? And then you develop your strategy, your tactics, and so forth. The thing to remember in today's world, if you are doing it by yourself, you are probably wrong. Because today's world is all about partnerships and relationships. If you're doing it by yourself, you're most likely wrong. And this bit's really important. With the amount of social media, with the amount of way that people get their information today, it's so important to control the narrative around what you're doing. And a lot of the agencies say, oh, we don't like Facebook, we don't like this, we don't. If you're not engaged with people in a manner about controlling the narrative, and it's often the story, not just the facts, it's the story. People get engaged by a narrative which they can relate to, supported by evidence, but they don't care about the numbers. They don't care about the evidence, they want to know the story, often based on the character and spirit of a place that you're moving forward and what your project is doing in that whole story about the future of a place. And then around the outside, there's this thing called authenticity. People in the world are going to not trust you. They're not going to want to participate with you. They're not going to believe a word you say unless you demonstrate your authenticity to them constantly. So, how do you discover deeply about your local area? We use this, which is just an intentional communities matrix, which just looks at the realm in which people live as individuals, in community, in the things that they do, and in relation to place. Now, it's interesting when you're doing your deep dive to find out about what's going on, if you want to find out about the people in your area and what's happening there. About 95% of government services are either to individuals or building things. And yet the most important things that we require in our society today are connected communities and how we get a sense of purpose in life. And I asked a bunch of public servants, very senior public servants, about why, and it was to do with Aboriginal communities, why was everything here and not there when this is what was required? They said, well, our KPIs are what gives us our contract back next year. So we have KPIs which are measured by what our inputs are rather than what our outcomes are, because they were protecting themselves. Okay, so then we design. So we talk about strategy, stakeholder management, communications plans, engagement methodology and collateral. We use this with our clients. This is just one page we stick up on the wall, and we have an inception meeting with them, and we talk about what are the desired outcomes, what are all the different channels we can use, the engagement focus that we're talking about, and then the different phases we're going through. And we often do it this way so that we get all the information right before we engage with people the first time. So if we've gone through this, if we've figured out what we need to, what people are like and what they need to understand, then it's easy to start to fill out this. And I'll give you an example. Oh yeah, this is it. This is Broome. I think I might have taken the words out. No, it's not here. I've got a really great team inside my organisation which is all about design, but they get really carried away with tricky stuff. And I'm a real Luddite when it comes to stuff. So this would have come up 11 different ways if they had their way, but it's just one. So when we look at a community, especially the stakeholder, to communities, we break them into different tiers according to different criteria. Strategic decision makers and influencers, representatives, broader community and individuals who might have a general interest. And then we go, how do we need to engage with them? And we figure out different ways of doing it. Because what you want, if you're involved in a really tricky project, what you don't want to have happen is that the first time a major decision maker hears about it, when he gets a telephone call from someone going, did you hear what the bastards are doing down at such and such? Because they'll go, no, tell me. What you want them to do is go, yes, isn't it fantastic that there's going to be a new aged care facility which is based on the needs of our community, and the person is. So you want to be preparing your audiences for each thing that happens to them over a long period of time. So this was Headland, and as I said, it's about 13,000 people. We ended up having 5,866 interactions through a whole series of different ways, including there are 3 different Aboriginal groups in that town, so we had to use the right protocols to find our way in to those communities and have consultation with a lot of the Aboriginal groups, because we wouldn't have built trust in the 6 months of that project. So it had to be done with people who they would go, yeah, I can talk to them. And the same with young people. I'm now a really old fart in the eyes of most young people, and by young people I mean people under 45, because that changes as well. So we use different methods of getting information and engaging people with young people. And so there were all sorts of different ways that we managed to get to people. Schools are one way, so there's a school thing, but you also want the kids who are disengaged from school to have input into stuff. They're not going to come and talk to me. They're going to be talking to people that they already hold in respect. And so you've got to find those people and get them engaged in the process as well. So then it's all about delivery. And it's about designing a delivery process which is appropriate for the community with whom you are wishing to engage. So this is the pub. So what we did mainly, and we had online surveys, we had websites, we had all of that. But the thing that brought them out is in the dungeon of the pub, we set it up like a really funky art gallery bar. And all the real funky people from Freo came out to it because they actually felt comfortable going there, drinking a little shardy. That's what they drink in Freo. Sorry, a little shardy. I didn't have my finger up. I apologise. They wouldn't have recognised the fact that I was drinking wine in Freo, but I didn't have my finger up. Sorry. I'm trying to get more mature as I get older. And the maturity apparently is a filter between your brain and your mouth, and I just controlled one. Something that happened up there. And I sort of give myself a little congratulations on the inside. It was good though, but I can't tell you. But there's also, with the Freo project, this is QE2, sorry, we had, because it's to do a lot with academics and with the people who live in that area are highly sophisticated. Their networks into government are really at the high level, so you can't treat them like they're mugs. You actually have to engage with them. So we had podcasts, we had people, we had doctors and academics talking about what was going on. We did all sorts of things to actually attract the people who are too busy to be engaged with you because they are working 80 and 90 hour weeks. And we did real tricky things with them about intercepting them between the car park and their office, because that's when you actually walk. We had people with keypads walking along beside them, talking to them. Can I spend? How far away is your office? 130 minutes. Let me talk to you. Yeah. Look, would you tell me advice? Oh, no. We have really nice young people who do that sort of stuff. So. Charming young man or woman comes up to you and says, I just need to ask some questions about how you find car parking here, because it's one of the big issues we've identified. And they go, oh yeah, I'd love to tell you about car parking. And then you say, there are a couple of other questions too. And so you actually engage them in that whole process. This was the stakeholder engagement thing in Broome. Well, this is in Broome on this side. The groups in Broome were so antagonistic to each other that we set up 8 different stakeholder groups, 8 different clusters. And they were the things to do with mining and with the mining side of it, oil and gas, agriculture, Aboriginals, young people, arts, local businesses. So we set up 8 different cluster groups and we met with them on a number of different occasions. And then we came together, and this is happening here, into what we call a cluster muster. We brought them all together. And I'm going to swear in a minute, so if anybody gets upset by swearing, please put their hands over their ears now, there's your warning. So we brought them into the room and we invented a game. And the game was on the middle of their table, there were 8 people at a table, on the middle of their table was like a big mat, and in it had all the projects that we'd come up during the discussion about what the future of Broome was, and then had the principles and values which we'd actually harvested from the 25 years of consultation that had happened prior to us being there. So we actually came into a community that was over-consulted. So we said, rather than ask you the basic questions, we're going to harvest stuff to come up with the principles, and then we'll test them with you to make sure that they're accurate. So we would give people, say, this is what we've come up with, and they went, did you make them up? We go, here is the list of all the different reports that you've actually been involved with recently, and tested them against them. So we had those around the outside. And then we gave each table $1,000 worth of betting chips, and said, bet on the things which will build the Broome that you want. And within about 20 minutes, and this was actually at the nice stage, and you can see by her face it hadn't been nice. People were poking each other in the chest saying, you just don't understand what Broome needs. And people, hands on their hips, and people walking away from the tables, and I had one of these on. So this is where you need to apologise. Oh, excuse me, ladies and gentlemen, can I have your attention? And they went, sure. And they quieted down. I said, I'll tell you what, if you can't come to a consensus at your table, get your $50 chip and stick it wherever the fuck you want. And tell everybody else to stick their chips wherever the fuck they want. Because you'll fuck up this game just like you're fucking up Broome. That was fairly subtle for me, that's what I pointed out. But within half an hour, the tables have been transformed. They're actually cooperating with each other, and there were all of these little patterns on the thing. We're going, if we invested our money this way, we could actually improve the education for our children, increase the opportunity for Aboriginal employment, and do the thing that I want to do. So you have to come up, you have to invent stuff, you have to be interesting. And in the Broome project, because of the number of Aboriginal corporations and people that were involved, we went out and had Aboriginal people interviewing Aboriginal entrepreneurs about the things that they were doing. We had it up on websites. We did little handout documents in cafes. You've got to figure out the way to engage people's hearts and minds in their place so they can see what the change is going to be and whether they support the change or not. It's fairly complex. But in the end, it has to be simple, super simple for the person that you want to engage with. There's no point at the end of it going, we tried all of these things and no one came. You've got to find the place or the thing that people want to engage with you with. 2, that was my second filter that worked today. And then deliver. All sorts of ways of delivering. Now we do, in areas where there's a high level of sensitivity around stuff, whether it's environment, or a culture, we do walking tours with people. We just say, come for a walk with us. Well, let's see what's important for you in your town now. Then we're going to talk to you about what the project is and how can we blend those things together. So this is Freo again. The council's got us doing a lot of work in Freo. And the thing that we showed people was that without employment, their town's going to go down the toilet. So how do you bring employment into that place? How do you make sure that people actually spend their money there in retail rather than drive 20 minutes to the nearest big box shopping centre? So how do you actually make sure that the people who are engaged in the creative industries there have places to sell stuff? And by wandering around, people going, we could perhaps do that. We could perhaps do that. And the reason why we often gather people around tables, we often do a thing called dialogue cafes, where you get 6 or 8 people around the table, and you give them the 3-course meal, and it might be really simple, or it might be really beautiful, depending on what your budget is, and you give them a menu of conversation that you want the table to talk about, because you don't want to just collect data from people. You want people with divergent opinions and views talking to each other, because they're going to be their neighbours. You want them to go, I disagree with you because of this. They go, have you ever thought about this? Because I've got teenage children and I want them to stay close to home. And they go, oh, I haven't got any teenage kids. I didn't know that was an issue. So you don't want to just collect data from people because you're going to put it in little siloed bundles. You want the people with divergent views to sit around together and discuss it. But you've got to provide a manner of doing that which is safe. And a guy called Theodore Zeldin said if you run a workshop, you'll get what people think. If you have people sit down together and share a meal or laugh or go on a walking tour, they will actually tell you what they feel as well as what they think. And in the space that we're in, because we are primarily a community development company, and as you heard earlier, my passion is people living rich and full lives and having the attitudes, attributes and skills to do that, but connected in communities where they can actually participate. And most of our clients, actually we won't work for people who don't do this, all of our clients go, we are willing to move into that community and be neighbours in that community, so what does that take? So a little bit of this has got to do with our own ethics as a company. We won't just go and badger an organisation into, a community into accepting something. And we won't, and I just did this the other day, there's a development happening in a suburb, and they said, oh, if it doesn't work, we'll go to SAT, the State Administrative Tribunal. And I said, well, you need to use a different company, because we don't go to SAT. We want to take the community through an honest and true process, and then you have to be willing to accept or not the consequences. And a big project in Fremantle at the moment, where, and it's an East Coast company because they think they can come over and just show us peasants how good development is done, because we are still a little bit, backward. But we accept that. And I sat down at the table with this guy 3 times before he said, Allan, I accept the fact, and I draw gates for them about where the decision needs to be taken at various points in time and what you need to do. And he said, I'm willing to accept if we get to that gate and we know it's not feasible, we'll pull out. But we're willing to spend that amount of money to get there. So that's why it's quite good fun. And then feedback. You've got to be able to provide feedback to the people that you're dealing with, and do it in a manner which is honouring of them, because at some point in time you're going to go back. I don't want to talk about that anymore.
Hey there. We need a microphone. So we've got a few minutes before lunch. Do we have questions for Allan?
Good.
You made the comment.
Can you wait for the mic? Sorry, thanks.
You made the comment before, which makes perfect sense, and we've heard it from other speakers as well, that authenticity is key to meaningful engagement that gets you somewhere. How do you demonstrate authenticity?
You need to show people the process that's going to be used over a long period of time. And you need to show them where they're going to have input. We almost always have a frequently asked questions book that we give people, which details the project and all the things which they're liable to want to ask in it. And and if someone asks a question we can't answer, we get back to them in 24 hours. So there are lots of little things which will build trust based on your authenticity. There's a great example of if you've got a 44-gallon drum and you want to you fill up one thimble of water at a time, and that's how you build trust. That's how you show your authenticity, one little thing at a time. If something goes wrong and you haven't got any trust in your 44-gallon drum, it just makes a terrible noise when the puncture happens. But if you've actually built trust, you've got time to repair it if you've made a mistake. So we had a client who, in their development, one of their subcontractors bulldozed the wrong side of the road. So they bulldozed Bush Forever.
Oh, that's awesome.
And someone rang the local government and said they just bulldozed the wrong side of the road to push forever. And they went, if that's such and such a company, and they knew it was a mistake. Because we've been working on that project for 12 years, and thimbleful by thimbleful, we'd build trust. Not what would normally happen, they would have put stop work order on that development. So it's about one thimbleful at a time, and everything you say you're going to do, you have to do.
I refer to that as the trust bank. You have a
Trust
piggy
bank.
bank, and every time you do something meaningful, you build up credit,
So you
and
knew
then
the
sometimes you can
answer
take
to
it
your
out.
question before you asked it.
Well, what you're saying to me, I would call transparency rather than
I know.
authenticity, but I guess it's
But-
two sides of the same coin.
I could go even deeper to say, I think it's really important that there, and it's a garden analogy, that there's bedrock, subsoil, topsoil, then there's trees, shrubs and annuals, and then use a climate and whatever else, birds and insects. If you move that across to the side, just your bedrock is why do you exist as an organisation. The subsoil is your values. The topsoil are your principles. Your long-term policies and plans and procedures need to be, the roots need to be deeply cemented into the bedrock, and your annuals need to be guided by your principles. And if you can demonstrate that every time you're involved in something or other, people go, actually, I know what you stand for. I know what's going on. That's where authenticity comes from. And so many organisations today, and I asked this question yesterday, so many organisations, people don't know the story of their organisation and why they exist. And it's really difficult to get transparency or any of the other things if there isn't this bedrock upon which your organisation is based. And that's where your authenticity will come from.
Challenge when you work in governments and they
Just
change all the time.
I was the director of a government department before I started creating communities. And so I know what the fight is, and I know, and today, and we work with local governments that change one officer somewhere in their system and everything falls apart and you have to re-establish it. But if you are deeply bedded in your bedrock, if it's your values and principles that are shining forward, you can actually start to convince others to be on that journey with you. But it's not easy.
Thank you so much, Allan. We might leave that there for this session. So I would firstly like to thank GHD for sponsoring this particular session. And I'd like to thank Sioux Campbell for giving us a ride with Cairns and Resilience, and Allan for being so frank and fearless in his